computer, share. Okay, what a mess. Okay, I'm recording now. Correct? Yes, I am recording. Okay, before we start, I would like us to let's see to talk a little bit about the paper. If you have any questions, and as I mentioned last time, you're not going to get any grades for the interim things that I asked you to submit along the way. So for this week, the topic and the theory. For next week, next Thursday, I would like you to submit like a reference list. However, it's really important that you submit and start working on the paper. So Frank, Isaac, and Sarah, please, if you can let me know what your topic is going to be and what theory you're going to use. This is just for all of you to see what, like as a group, what you're going to work on. So there are 2 people working on cancer, 2 people on cardiovascular disease. So you might want to like have a conversation, for example, share articles, share ideas. One person is working on COVID, which would be really interesting. Depression, smoking, women's infertility. So like, you know, depression, women's infertility, COVID are sort of like unique topics, new topics. Vaccine behavior, of course. I will share, okay, Isaac, gender-based violence and syndemics. Okay, great. I will add this to the table. And I will post this. One person, Fatima, you said if it's okay to change. Yes, you can change, but you can change like today or tomorrow, because after that, you don't want to do any work and then go back and do double work. So if you decide on your topic and your theory, yeah, and now Jana is asking the same question. You want your work to accumulate. You don't want to do work and then disrupt it and go back and start doing research on another topic, another theory. You're going to waste time. So if you spend between now and tomorrow a couple of hours to really scope, even if you just do Scholar Google, just scope and see what's out there, and just decide on your topic and the theory, and just move ahead with that. That would be much, much better for you, more efficient. Okay. Okay. Gender-based violence and syndemics is really interesting. Social relations, social networks, also, and HIV is also interesting. As you see here, there isn't a lot of variation in the theories. So most of you are using the life course theory or the fundamental cause, and then a couple using the social relations and social networks. Maybe because we're going to talk about syndemics today, and then we're going to address intersectionality and feminist theory next week. So you're still not familiar. But let's see what you're going to come up with if you want to change, but very quickly. Some of the topics like gender-based violence, infertility, for example, you can definitely use the feminist theory in addition to fundamental cause. Yes, Frank?
Doctor, I'm sorry for not submitting earlier, but I want to ask, like, along the way, like, I mean, in a few days, can I really get like used to maybe like two or three theories, then I choose and change?
Yes, you can, but really by next Thursday, you have to have your theory. You have to have your theory. Now you can write a paper where it's life course and interspersed with a little bit of intersectionality or feminist theory. However, the paper, because it's, 4 to 6 pages, really, I don't think it can handle more than one theory with maybe a little bit of integration of something else. If you want to, let's say, address cancer or vaccine using more than one theory, then you need more than 6 pages. Or, and I don't want to read more than 6 pages. In the past, there have been occasions where I would stop, like at page 6, I would stop, or in another occasion at page 10, I just stopped. So if the student didn't didn't bring in all their ideas and arguments in the first 6 pages, I mean, you can start, your first draft can be 10 pages, 20 pages, but the final draft that you submit really needs to be 6 pages maximum. So the point here is that 6 pages can handle one theory, maybe a little bit of like integration of something else, but not more than that. Okay. Yeah. So looking at all the theories and then deciding by next Thursday. Because next Thursday you can have, you don't need to, but I highly recommend that you submit to me a reference list of maybe 10 references that you're going to use in your paper, and really select these references, spend some time on selecting these references so that you don't just send me any 10 references and then later your paper will have completely different references. Absolutely. I mean, from 2000 to 2015, there's a sort of like a different time frame in terms of what is recent and what is not recent. Absolutely. Any articles from 2000 until now are, I would consider, recent. A lot of the life course theory articles were written in the early 2000s as well. Yeah, and then sometimes you might want to refer to really a classic. So in the case of social relations, social network, there are classical writings on social relations from the 1960s, for example. Or you can also use some good review articles that basically bring a lot of pieces of this literature together in one place. Okay. Okay, and then a last point I want to mention is that if you're a PhD student, or if you're someone working on your practicum, ILE, and plan like after graduation to carry on and work on a specific issue, and you've done some work in the past, let's say on, I don't know, adolescent smoking or on vaccine behavior, it's fine to build on that work. However, the paper that you submit for this course should be different from any other paper that you have written. It should really build on what you've done. You shouldn't have like not even 10 or 20% of the paper should be something that you've written and submitted for another course. Okay, but it helps a lot if you're working on one topic or on one issue. And you have accumulated a lot of knowledge on that issue, it will help you actually write a better paper, because you have a background and you're then moving in a specific direction and analyzing or thinking about that health issue. Okay. Any questions about the paper from anyone?
So Prof, hello Prof. Okay, Prof, is it okay then to change, like to find a field like after this class, the one that we're having right now? Like, is it okay like to have a topic and share with you like after, exactly after the lecture?
Yeah, you can take until Monday. You can take until Monday.
Okay.
Yeah,
right,
because then you can decide based on what you find based on a preliminary search. Okay. Yeah, you don't want to get stuck where you select a topic and then discover that you can't really write about it using a specific theory, because you hardly find anything. So do a little bit of search then, but until Monday, because by Thursday, then you need to have a list of 10 references.
Sure.
Okay. And I think I promised to send you some, maybe some material on what a critical review is. And I will do that. I'll do that, because a critical review is not just a basic literature review. And at the same time, critical review is not criticism, particularly as a student, as a master's student, when you're being introduced to an area of research, you still don't have enough of a background on this area of research to be able to critique it, or not critique it, but to criticize it, or also critique it. So, but a critical literature review means that you bring things together and you look for parallels, you look for different points of view, you look for contradictions, different type of data that bring about different results, and you sort of like synthesize it in one place, just to show your reader that you have done enough research to know quite a bit about the topic that you're writing about. But again, this is a paper for a course. It's not a thesis, or you don't have to get into critiquing the literature in that sense. Okay. Yes. Okay. I will share some material with you. So let's talk about syndemics, unless somebody has any questions. And this is the first time, actually, this is the first year that I decided I would like to present syndemics in this course, because I have been thinking about it actually in terms of my work, and I've seen a couple of readings on syndemics and COVID-19, and basically the writings on syndemics, which come, as you've noticed from one of the articles, which come more from like the medical anthropology literature, have made their way into public health. So the syndemics has been increasingly discussed in the public health literature and research. Okay, so let me ask you. I can show the basically what let me show basically the definition of syndemics. I'll go back a couple of slides in a minute, but let me get from you, what did you understand from the article by Singer, at least, what syndemics are? What do we mean when we use the term syndemics? And I would like today, yes, Reem, and after Reem, I'd like others to participate, like Jana, like Sarah. I would like you to also participate and share a little bit today. So Reem, go ahead.
Okay, so syndemic, it's like an interaction between different diseases or health outcome, and this may like exacerbate the health consequences of in a certain population, and mainly these diseases are related to health inequalities based on political instabilities and social inequalities.
Okay. So there's the word interaction between different diseases, right? The word interaction between diseases.
Yes.
And there's there's exacerbation due to political and social structural factors, right?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Reem. Fatima, go ahead.
As Reem said, and also it addresses the adverse interaction between diseases and health conditions. And they addressed how it emerges under conditions of inequality and inequity caused by disparities, poverty, stress, and structural violence.
Okay. Great. Jana, would you like to add something as well?
Actually, I don't have much to add to what my colleagues already said, but it's basically, as they said, how like how different diseases can influence each other in a specific social context. And it also focuses on, this theory also like focuses on the health rights of humans, and how everyone has the right to, to have access to, if we want to talk about access, whether access to health or equality or equity in several, health conditions. And
okay, great. So between the three of you, I think we got the point of what syndemics means. So syndemics, it's basically the synergy between two epidemics, or between, I mean, if we don't want to use the term epidemic, synergy between two epidemics, but it's a synergy, or it's a relationship between two health conditions, whether these health conditions are diseases or even risk factors, for example, that appear in a population. Syndemics moves us away from thinking about specific health conditions or diseases into thinking about populations in general, meaning we zoom in on the population rather than on the disease or the health outcome itself, and we try to understand what is happening in that population, what are the diseases in that population that interact with each other, and this interaction then makes each one of these health conditions worse. Okay, so there's some deleterious interaction that exacerbates or makes worse the negativity of each of these health outcomes. We'll look at some examples today in the next hour and a half or so. Okay, so it's aggregation, it's a population level view, not a disease or a risk factor view. And then when you look or zoom in on a population, then you try to understand, why is it that this population has these 2 or 3 or 4 different negative health outcomes? And then how do these health outcomes interact with each other? Okay, and then the third really important thing is how these health outcomes interact with each other under, or in the context, not under, in the context of certain structural, political, economic conditions. Okay. The word clustering is really important in syndemics, and it's used. I want to show you, I think it's the next slide. I should remember these slides. Yes. Yeah. I worked on these slides a few days ago, so I should have reminded myself. Okay, so if you remember last time when we talked about the life course, we talked about the concept of the accumulation of risk, meaning that when risks happen over time, you have the first, so each one of these purple dots, and this one is not a dot, it's an ellipse, because I wanted to write lead poisoning, lead exposure in it, so it got bigger. But each one of these purple dots is a risk, okay? But they don't happen at the same time. There's a risk that happens in early childhood, or even, sometimes at birth. Then another risk happens at age 6, and another risk happens at age 12, 13, 14, whatever. So at age 6, let's say the risk, okay, at birth or at very young age, the risk is lead poisoning. Later at age 6, the risk is poor quality school. At age 13 or 14, the risk may be starting to smoke, joining, a peer group that smokes and engages in delinquent behavior. At age 17, 18, dropping, or earlier than 18, dropping out of school, and engaging in maybe criminal activities, and then so on and so forth. So here in this case, the risk is accumulating over time. Okay, That's what the life course presents to us, is that this accumulation over time makes a difference. It's not only about this one risk that is taking place in the person's life at age 18. It's also about all of these other risks that have taken place earlier and that are impacting the person's vulnerability over time. Now, what the syndemics view presents is something a bit different, maybe not very different in its impact, but it's different in its, and how it functions, which is the clustering of risk. So the clustering of risk means that at a specific age, the person may have 2 or more types of risks that are taking place at the same time. They are clustering. Okay, and they are happening, they're taking place under specific social, economic, political conditions. Okay, and they're taking place at the same time. The person is being exposed or is vulnerable to these 2 or 3 risks at the same time. And the risks can be risk factors like smoking, like substance abuse, or the way we think about risk factors. We think about poor diet, substance use, smoking as risk factors, or they can be health conditions like HIV/AIDS. Okay. This is what's called the SAVA syndemic, which is substance abuse, violence, and HIV/AIDS. And it was mentioned in your in the Singer, and both articles. Are there any questions about this? Yeah, somebody has a question.
Doctor, I wanted to ask you, like, outcome.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, I was saying the risk factors should come before the health outcomes, like the substance abuse and violence should come before HIV.
Right. So usually we're programmed to think that you will see this in a slide in a few minutes. We're programmed to think that, okay, you have the risk factor, and then this risk factor leads to the negative or the poor health outcome. Yes, absolutely. However, at the same time, you can have the risk factor and the health outcome operating at the same time. So substance abuse, or at least, all forms of substance abuse, but particularly intravenous drug use, for example, is a risk factor for HIV transmission. Okay. Now, but at the same time, you can think of substance abuse as a risk factor slash outcome that is happening at the same time that the person is also exposed to other risk factors that lead to higher vulnerability to HIV/AIDS. Okay, violence, for example, poverty, the need to, living in poor conditions, which basically increase a person's vulnerability to engaging in sex for money, for example, which puts the person at higher risk of HIV. Okay. I'm going to go back a couple of slides to tell you that one of the first syndemics that I have been introduced to, in fact, it wasn't even called a syndemic, but when you start out in any MPH program, that basically in a context where HIV is really important, you get a very good dose of basically the risk or this relationship, this really deleterious relationship between HIV and tuberculosis. And there was a time actually at the beginning of the HIV epidemic in the 1980s where certain population groups, whether they are prisoners or whether they are prisoners, let's say in a high income country like in the US, or if they are women who live in poverty in other contexts, for example, in Haiti or Haiti, which is an island in the Western Hemisphere, very close to, I mean, it borders Cuba. It's very close to New York and the US, where most people who with HIV die from TB. Not necessarily most, but yes, absolutely. There was a very synergistic relationship between, there is a synergistic relationship between HIV and tuberculosis. And the context is very important. The context in high income countries, for example, is prisons, men in prisons. The context in low income countries, particularly countries in Africa or in Haiti, it's women who live in poverty as well. Yes, so yes, there's this concept of opportunistic infections, and it's basically related to this synergistic relationship between HIV and tuberculosis, and it's very biological. I mean, at the end, there's this biological relationship where HIV reduces immunity in the body, and that makes basically, as you know, some of you know, a lot of people test positive for tuberculosis, but they don't develop tuberculosis in the lungs. The bacteria remains dormant for a long time. However, with HIV infection, with the weakening of the immune system, then the bacteria flourishes and infects the lungs, and the tuberculosis develops in the body. Okay, so this was a very important issue in the 1980s and 1990s. I'm not sure the extent to which it continues to be a big issue in HIV work, but it led, of course, to multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, which was very problematic because then the treatment, then, you know, we needed to continue to develop new antibiotics. The treatment for tuberculosis was less effective and more costly because people needed to take 3 or 4 different antibiotics at the same time in order to make sure that, you know, these antibiotics cover all kinds of, you know, all kinds of resistance that the bacteria has developed. So this is one of the first syndemics. Does anybody know more about TB and HIV that you want to share with us? I haven't seen much on this, but I can tell you in the 1990s, this was a very big deal. In Malawi, 47% of people living with HIV tested TB positive. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's not only about, you know, I mentioned that this is a purely biological. It's not only about the biological, but it's also about the fact that if we forget about this, but the social conditions that lead to increasing risk of HIV are the same social conditions that also increase vulnerability to tuberculosis. Poverty leading to crowded housing, and then poverty leading to people exchanging sex for money and putting themselves at higher risk. Okay, great. And the health-seeking behavior. Zaina, yes, go ahead, Zaina.
Yes, I just wanted to say something close to what you said, that it's not necessarily biologic, especially crowding with TB particularly, and it's really fast. And usually people who live in crowding are poor people. Sure. So no education sometimes, and this, using needles, sharing needles, etc.
Okay, so yes, absolutely. The social conditions have, I mean, there are fundamental social conditions, and these fundamental social conditions then manifest in both crowding and exchanging sex, transactional sex. Crowding, of course, increases tuberculosis. Transactional sex increases the risk of HIV infection. And then also other social conditions that basically continue to, I mean, violence, for example. I mean, people who engage in transactional sex are more vulnerable to being physically violated, or live in also conditions that where street violence takes place, for example. Yeah. In Lebanon, 84% of HIV cases are males and 78% are caused by homosexual transmission. This was a case study I worked on with Dr. Jocelyn. Okay, okay. Yeah, I know that Lebanon has an HIV profile that is more similar to the United States and European profile at the beginning of the HIV epidemic, where the majority of the cases are among men who have sex with men. And the cases among women are few. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly also whether the cases among women are heterosexual women. I know some people did research on this. I actually know someone, her name is Rachel Kaplan, who wrote on HIV among women. They're afraid to report, which increases spread. Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, even in countries in the region where there is HIV testing in public clinics, people prefer to go to private clinics and pay out of pocket if they have the means, because they don't want to be in a public place and risk being seen or having their results shared. Yeah. Okay. So, okay, here what I want to open up is a question about questions, about whether it's research questions or practical questions that that we raise. Okay, we're usually used to asking the question of what leads to what. Okay, even sometimes, you know, we say in cross-sectional research, there's no causality, we only look for associations. But in general, in public health, and I dare to say that this is a traditional or a conventional approach in public health, where we say, okay, what risk factor leads to a specific health outcome? A simple example is you know, research that has been done in the 1960s and later, where we have asked, does smoking lead to lung cancer? Does smoking lead to cardiovascular disease? Okay, oftentimes disregarding structural factors, because it becomes more complex when we start to look at structural factors, and we find it easier to say, okay, let's look at just one risk factor and one health outcome. Okay, so this is a traditional way of asking questions. It's about a relationship between two entities. One is a risk factor and one is the health outcome. What we have done in this course is we have moved a little bit from asking this question that focuses on risk factors and said, let's ask the question of what are the fundamental causes, rather, that make certain groups more vulnerable to this health outcome. So this is a fundamental cause type of question, is what is it about the social conditions that we live in that make certain groups more vulnerable both to risk factors and to health outcomes? Here in the fundamental cause, we are acknowledging that at the end, it's this risk factor that is leading to the health outcome. At the end, it's smoking that's leading to lung cancer, or it's poor diet that's leading to diabetes. However, fundamental cause, and you've all answered this question in your assignment 3, I think, one of the key messages of the fundamental cause is that even if you look at the relationship between the risk factor and the health outcome, you have to contextualize the risk factor in the fundamental cause. You cannot ignore the fundamental cause, even if your question is about how the risk factor associates with the health outcome. Okay. So for example, even if we're thinking about smoking, okay, are we talking about smoking in the context, smoking cigarettes, in the context of someone who works in a factory, who is exposed to asbestos, who is exposed to other chemicals, and who is maybe exposed to stress? And how does that contribute to cardiovascular disease? Or are we asking about smoking in the context of, I mean, I'm going to give you another extreme, in the context of smoking a cigar, an expensive cigar, in a social setting? Okay. So the fundamental cause or the context here is very different. The risk factor is smoking and nicotine and tobacco and all of that. But the conditions or the contextual context, the fundamental cause and the context is different. And you can bet that people who smoke a cigar socially are not negatively affected in terms of their cardiovascular disease profile, in the same way that someone who smokes a pack of cigarettes and works in a factory where they are exposed to stress and other chemicals in terms of their cardiovascular disease risk. Yes, the risk factor is the mechanism or the pathway, absolutely. And that's basically the fundamental cause argument, is that the fundamental cause operates through different pathways, and these pathways may change. But the relationship that stays the same is between the fundamental cause and the poor health at the end. And there's been some sophisticated research on this in Europe, where in Europe, there's some data showing that whereas in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, the pathway between poverty and poor health in Europe was smoking. Now, as smoking rates have been going down in a number of European countries, not in all European countries, but some European countries, smoking rates have dropped dramatically. And the data is showing that the pathway now is related to consumption of unhealthy food. So the pathway has changed. But nonetheless, people of different social classes have different risk profiles to chronic disease outcomes. Yes, we usually think of other factors as confounders if we are focusing on risk factors. What do you mean by confounders? Like age and income and gender? We usually think of them as confounders, right? And we just control for them in epidemiological research or in epidemiological analysis. And there are some people who argue very much against this, because when you treat income, for example, as a confounder, then you're explaining its effect away. You're ignoring its effect, rather than to actually think about the effect of income on the health outcome, not as a confounder, but as a fundamental cause, as a determinant, basically. Okay, but thank you for bringing that up, because this is a big issue in social epidemiology, actually, is the use of income and education as confounders, and there are debates about this as well. Okay, so I'm going to move you now to a third level, a third type of a question, and then I will ask you for your feedback. So the third question is the syndemics question. And here the syndemics question, instead of thinking about risk factor leading to a health outcome, it's saying that the risk factor or the health outcome and another risk factor or health outcome exist in the same population. And there's a synergistic relationship between the two. Okay. So the question here then is, what is the relationship between these two risk factors / health outcomes? How do they interact with each other in a specific context? And in this specific context, we have fundamental causes like education, poverty, lack of security, displacement, political conflict are fundamental causes. Exclusion, social exclusion are fundamental causes. So in that context, how does this context influence both the risk factor and the health outcome? And it doesn't matter here, it can be substance use, and you can think of substance use or abuse as a risk factor or a health outcome in and of itself. Then here it might be HIV, it might be, I'm going to give you an example related to homelessness now. It might be injury, for example. Yeah, okay. Then the final piece, I don't know if you were looking with me on the slides or if you have your own slides, but the final piece is that also, how does this synergistic interaction between these two risk factors / health outcomes make each one worse or more deleterious? Okay. So I just, this is my representation of like I made it into like a gray color just to show that it's the same risk factor or health outcome, but it's actually its impact now is worse because of this synergistic interaction. Just like if you think about TB, tuberculosis. So here, the health outcome is testing positive for tuberculosis. However, tuberculosis might be dormant in the person's body. However, in the presence of HIV, then it explodes, it comes out and infects the lung cells and becomes worse. At the same time, HIV, in the presence of tuberculosis, HIV, the impact of HIV is worse in terms of containing, the effectiveness of the HIV treatment or containing the HIV infection. Okay, let me read these two. Zaina is saying, I wonder why depression and anxiety disorders are linked. Is it biological or also fundamental causes? Okay. And is it always negative synergy? Let me answer the second question by Melody first, and then I'll go back to Zaina's question on depression and anxiety. So is it always negative synergy? Again, we are programmed to always study or look at negative health outcomes. I actually spent some time many years ago looking at self-rated health or subjective health status, trying to focus on what it means when people report that they have positive health. So I did work a little bit on positive health outcomes. But in syndemics, the examples that I've read on so far usually focus on these negative synergies, that one health outcome negatively affects or makes the other health outcome more severe. Yeah. In the life course, there's this idea of cumulative disadvantage, but also there's cumulative advantage. So, and you can think about, our lives here in Lebanon, for example. There's cumulative disadvantage, but at the same time, there's cumulative advantage. Children who are born into families that are well off. At age 5, the child goes to private school. At age 12, the child starts, is in sports and extracurricular activities, their cognitive development. I mean, then the private school is one advantage. the engagement in sports and extracurricular activities is another advantage. At age 17 or 18, this person graduates from high school and is accepted into AUB. That's a third accumulation of advantage. So the life course also addresses not only cumulative disadvantage, but also cumulative advantage and privilege. Yeah.
Prof, I wanted to reflect on the syndemics, I think, between gender-based violence and early marriage. Like, hello?
Yeah, I hear you.
Okay, great. So when we look at these two as healthy outcomes, let's say violence among maybe women and early marriage, look at, of course, at the same time, there are all mechanisms that are coming from the fundamental cause, which might be due to poor living conditions or poverty, so to say. And these two, they might interact, being up with some synergies in the sense that in early marriage would exacerbate gender-based violence because we're looking at maybe a young girl who is just married to someone who is a little bit maybe, and again, maybe in the context that there is more masculinity issues. So that would result into gender-based violence. And at the same time, gender-based violence will interact even like the children, for example, that are born there might even like end up marrying early as well, and the circle, like the vicious circle, kind of like continues within this syndemic question.
Yes, absolutely. I will actually, in a couple of slides, I will present you to my my syndemic that I've been thinking about for a couple of months actually, which relates to early marriage, because that's something I'm working on. So yes, Isaac, what you're saying is very relevant to what I'm going to present in a few minutes. Yeah. For Antoine's question, whether it's just one fundamental cause or a combination, no, it can be more. It actually, there's also not only an accumulation of risk factors / health outcomes, it can be a combination of fundamental causes. So the fundamental cause can be the fundamental causes can be poverty and violence, neighborhood violence, poverty and lack of, or violence and lack of, let's say, healthy food in the neighborhood. So yes, absolutely. It can be a combination. Yes, there are some people who have looked at the interaction between education and poverty in neighborhoods as well, and to sort of like try to disentangle whether like people who have high levels of education, even if they live in poverty, if they are protected by their education, or not necessarily, that living in poverty supersedes basically the level of education and how much a person knows. Poverty and displacement, absolutely, yeah. Okay, you're ahead of the game, but now I will present to you a syndemic that I'm calling Rima, and one of my colleagues, his name is Rima, and she's not happy about this, but in a couple of slides. Okay, but let me give you an example. And this is very important. There's actually a paper that looks at homelessness. It doesn't use the language of syndemics, but it uses the language of, are we asking the correct question? And the argument here is that sometimes, even if you get the correct answer, if you do research and you get the correct answer, and you know, research is not about a correct answer, it's more about exploring. And but sometimes if your question is not the correct question, even if you get the correct answer, then you're not on the right track. So one of the things to start with is to think, okay, am I asking the correct question? Homelessness in many parts of the world is considered a health outcome, a public health outcome. And for those of you who live in Beirut, Maybe you don't walk on the streets of Beirut as much, at least since March of 2020, but you can notice that there's the phenomenon of homelessness in Beirut. And it's very interesting to think about it in the context here. So homelessness in Lebanon may be completely different than homelessness in London or in any European city, may be completely different than homelessness in an Asian country or an African country. Particularly under, yes, I mean, you see people, you see specific people, particularly near AUB, sometimes you see people who are like in their 50s and 60s who are homeless, and sometimes women. There used to be a woman actually who's homeless in the AUB neighborhood, and then I stopped seeing her. I don't know what happened actually. And there was a homeless man who was always on the street who passed away. Who, you know, they found him in the morning, one morning in the winter. They found him one morning in front of one of the businesses on Bliss Street, and he had passed away, unfortunately. There were rumors that he used to be a physics professor at AUB. I don't think this is true. And then something happened, mental health issue happened, and then he became homeless. Anyways, there are writings about mental health and substance abuse and homelessness. And the idea is that there's, yes, she did have long curly hair. Yeah, the woman. Yeah, and she was actually a bit aggressive. She would like spit on people on the street, and so there are these issues that, not issues, but there are these arguments that mental health, because a lot of homeless people have mental health issues or substance abuse issues. There's this argument that there's an association between mental health and homelessness. Okay, so you can ask, if you're someone who is interested in doing research on homelessness, you can ask the question of, how does substance abuse as a risk factor, how does it associate with or lead to homelessness? Okay, so this is the more traditional, the basic question that you can ask on the relationship between substance abuse and homelessness. Okay, you can ask a more sophisticated question, which is about, it doesn't ignore substance abuse as a risk factor, but it asks the question of, what is it about the urban context or the social organization or the social fabric or the family relations, but also what is it about the urban context, the availability of affordable housing, something in sociology called gentrification, for example. I don't know if some of you have heard this term before, but it basically refers to which has been happening in the Beirut area, the AUB area, which is getting rid of old buildings and building new high rises that are extremely expensive, people that are not affordable for people to rent. That's called gentrification. You know, also when you have, and this phenomenon maybe stopped in Beirut since the economic downturn, but when you start to see like Starbucks and the Gap and like other businesses opening in Beirut and selling things that are expensive, not affordable, that's called gentrification. So what is it about substance abuse as a risk factor, okay, within this context, in this context of changing urban conditions, increasing rent, maybe lack of affordable housing, gentrification, also changes in the social, in the family, extended family relations that are exacerbating, that are leading, you know, to substance abuse, which is leading to homelessness. Okay, so then substance abuse would lead to poor mental health. Then people who are substance abusers will be fired from their jobs. They can't find other jobs. They fall more into poverty. Then they become homeless. Okay, the term is gentrification. Let me see if I can. It's used in sociology. It happens in urban centers and like in many like old neighborhoods, then become gentrified. And then the people who used to live in them can no longer afford to stay in them. So they have to move out. They have to move out, and then this impacts their ability to keep jobs and to like like if there's no good, if there isn't good transportation, then they can't get to their job, or it costs them more to get to their job. And yeah. Okay. The syndemics question then would be that substance abuse and homelessness are health outcomes or risk factors that are equal to each other, in that they are an outcome of this changing urban context and social context, and they interact with each other, meaning people who are substance abusers are more likely to fall into homelessness, and then people who become homeless then become more and more substance abusers to cope with homelessness. Then then they would, any money that they would get from people giving them money, they would spend it on substance abuse. I'm not sure to what extent this is happening now, but not now, but this is happening in Beirut or Lebanon, but in other urban cities, the idea is that people who are homeless and who beg for money then spend the money on alcohol or drugs, or yeah. So here, this synergy between homelessness and substance abuse makes substance abuse worse and makes homelessness worse in its impact on the person's health and well-being. Okay, so that's the idea of basically you have two health outcomes. One you can say is a risk factor, substance abuse and homelessness. And you can ask the question in three different ways. You can ask it in the traditional way on the relationship between the risk factor and the outcome. You can ask it through a fundamental cause framework, where you don't ignore the risk factor, but you contextualize it within the fundamental cause in its relationship to the health outcome, which is homelessness. Or you can think of it as a syndemic, where in urban contexts, substance abuse and homelessness are two outcomes of this changing urban context that interact with each other and lead to become worse, basically, because of this interaction. Okay. Are there any questions about this or comments? Okay. Okay, so I'm building here my key messages as we move along in the semester. If you remember, the first, well, I forgot to enter one of the key messages that we talked about early on in the semester, which is changing knowledge does not necessarily change behavior. Okay, so any intervention should not rely on changing knowledge, because if you tell people something, if you give people the accurate piece of information, you can bet 90% of them will give it back to you in the next week or 2 weeks. They'll remember it and they'll give it back to you. But when it comes to changing behavior, that is a much more complex issue. The other key message is never to ignore the context in which risk factors and health outcomes manifest. Always think about the context. If your research is in Lebanon, it's a very different context than if your research is in Malawi. Very different than if your research is in London or Berlin, for example. Particularly, I mean, not particularly, but if we think about the example of homelessness, the social context has completely different meaning when it comes to homelessness in these three places. Another important key message is always learn to live with complexity rather than simplify. try to appreciate complexity actually and think about it. It's more important to acknowledge complexity and think about it rather than to simplify and ignore the complexity and try to come up with an answer. Because the answer in most cases, if you don't take the full complex, all of these complex factors into account, you can bet that your answer or your research is not going to lead to anything meaningful. And then always, before you think about your answer, always ask whether you asked the right question, the correct question. Okay. So I hope that you will carry these messages with you in the future, no matter what you work on and whether you remember other things in this course or not. Knowledge translation is not warranted. What do you mean by this?
I meant bringing knowledge to action. I mean, even if you inform someone, it doesn't guarantee that they are translating the knowledge to a good behavior or a healthy behavior or healthy options in life.
Yes, 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 absolutely. So the processing of knowledge into just the absorption of knowledge and it's processing it into, it's not only just regurgitating and giving knowledge back, but it's about processing it into attitudes and into behaviors and into actions as well, is where this gets disrupted, in fact. Okay. I think translating knowledge into behavior. Okay. So this is just a basic, repetition of from the Singer article, where basically it's important to identify systemics. It's also important to do research to understand the pathways. So I gave you, and you may know more about this. Those of you who have like a biology or nursing or medical background may know more about this. The relationship, the biological relationship between HIV and tuberculosis. But for more complicated syndemics, like the SAVA syndemic, the VIDA syndemic, which are mentioned in your articles, it's really important to think about the pathways, and not only to say that there's a relationship between depression and diabetes. Okay, what is this relationship? What is the pathway? What is the biological? What is the social? What is the behavioral? The relationships or the pathways can be biological. In terms of TB and HIV, there's of course the social, but then there's the, basically the dormant cells becoming, coming out and becoming infectious under the biological condition of reduced immunity in HIV. There's biological behavioral, there's behavioral structural pathways, there are structural pathways, and basically these are the relationships between the different health outcomes. And it's important to think about these pathways. The article by Singer actually gets into like a little bit of detail that I didn't even completely capture in terms of the biological and the behavioral relationships. For those of you who are interested in this, you can go back to the Singer article and you can look for other articles that specifically describe these pathways and how they operate. This, of course, requires research. It's not about me coming in and saying, oh, this is the biological behavioral pathway. There needs to be research, absolutely, in order to understand this. Okay, so, but this is really a simplistic way of saying that in the HIV, AIDS, and TB, there's a clear biological pathway. There's more than that, of course. There's the social and the structural, okay? But at least we know that there's a biological pathway. In the SAVA syndemic, which is the substance abuse, violence, AIDS, there's a behavioral structural pathway or interaction, synergy, okay? In the VIDA, which has been studied among immigrants, in the US, there's the violence, immigration, depression, diabetes, and abuse relationships or pathways. And these are, you can think of them as structural, behavioral, and even, structural, biological, and even / behavioral. Okay. The Singer article, again, goes into more details about this, which I think we don't have time to do here. Okay, so I want to introduce you now, and I'd like your feedback, your critical feedback also, it's important, to this endemic. Refugeehood, education or lack of access to education, early marriage, and mental health in adolescents. This is based on my work. Mental health was not part of this work at all at the beginning, but it appeared as a really important element of the work that we are doing. I actually don't remember if I spoke about the Amina Early Marriage Project in this course before, but very quickly, this is an intervention study, and it's what's called implementation research, meaning that you design an intervention and you start working on it, but then you actually study the intervention as it is moving along. And then if there are any challenges or any methodological aspect of this intervention that is not working, you stop, you revise it, and then you move ahead. So that's implementation research. It's basically a study of how research is carried out, is implemented, and then how researchers can address the challenges while they are conducting their research, rather than, reporting on these challenges later on. So this is a study, an intervention with Syrian refugee adolescent girls between the age of 11 to 17 years old. It's in Beqa area. It focuses on sexual and reproductive health, but it's really an early marriage intervention. Part of addressing early marriage is to provide adolescent girls with knowledge and skills related to sexual and reproductive health. But the long-term outcome is really to delay marriage for as long as possible. Education, of course, here, and access to education is very important. This is a quasi-experimental study, meaning that we're not randomizing girls, we're randomizing communities. And it's multi-component because we're working with the mothers as well, and we're working on the policy, on the local policy level as well. Oops. There's a very important context here that we're working under. The context of deprivation, the context of displacement, and the context, which is very important to talk about maybe next week in the feminism intersectionality, you'll get introduced to it. A context of patriarchy as well, meaning that girls really are, particularly young girls, have very little agency, are very disempowered in this community in terms of their rights, the right to education, which is not only like family patriarchy, but it's also like a higher level policy structural as well. Okay, so what happened? Okay, this is a logic frame. You will see these slides. You have this slide in on Moodle. Don't worry about this. I just want to show you that this logic frame is really complex. I don't know if those of you who are taking the evaluation course have already been introduced to logic frames, and if Dr. Maya Sieverding introduced the Amina logic frame. It's complex, and I have some issues with it. And here, this piece here, which is, I don't know if you can read it because it's red over orange. It says improvement in self-esteem and mental well-being of the girls. This was added because I thought it's really important. We cannot work on early marriage or sexual reproductive health without addressing mental well-being here. Okay, so don't worry about this logic frame. But you know, this has been a study going on for 4 years. First, we had like a prevalence study, a cross-sectional study, and then we had a pilot intervention. And in January 2020, we started the baseline for the real intervention, and we stopped. We couldn't finish it because of COVID. But we did the baseline for 429 girls between the age of 11 to 17. Okay, so the baseline had a lot of questions on sexual reproductive health knowledge, skills, puberty, early marriage. But then it had questions on education. And what we found out here, and it's not that we weren't expecting this, but it's a big problem when you're designing an intervention on early marriage. And then you find out that between the age of 11 to 17, 36% of the girls do not attend school, any school, formal or informal. And you find out that almost 1 in 5 girls cannot read a sentence. In the baseline, we actually had a sentence at the end that we took from, I think we took it from like a 5th grade textbook, a Lebanese textbook, 5th grade. And we just, it's an Arabic sentence, of course. And we asked the girl to read it. And we found out that 1 in 5 girls couldn't read this sentence. So then again, from an implementation research point of view, how do you function? How do you have an intervention on early marriage when there's like a foundation or the fundamental cause of literacy and education is not there? Okay, so what we're doing is we did some revisions. Okay, so this is implementation research. We went back and we revised the material that we were going to use, basically, so that we had pictures, and you know, we reduced the number of words. We changed the activities so that the girls could engage in these activities without needing to read. We also, and this was done in the pilot as well, we also introduced education support sessions as an incentive. And then, you know, basically these are questions for us. Can you have sexual and reproductive health literacy if you don't have functional literacy? And I don't work on health literacy. I know Dr. Marco Bardas and Dr. Tamar Kabakian work on this. I don't have a strong background in health literacy, but I'm raising the question, can you have health literacy if you don't have functional literacy? My answer is no, but I don't know. This is based on my personal, it's not based on research. And then the other thing is to think about the education, you know, is education, we want to provide education support sessions in order to improve the girls' basically absorption of the intervention. But is that the only thing that we need to do, is use education as an instrument to improve the intervention? Or shall we think about education as a fundamental human right or a fundamental cause? Yeah. So the functional health literacy, or the sexual reproductive health literacy we are aiming for is for the girls to, at least the girls who are at high risk of early marriage at age 15, 14 or 15, is to basically have sexual reproductive health literacy related to sexually transmitted diseases, pregnancy, the link between the menstrual cycle and pregnancy, for example, which was not there. I mean, some of our research showed that girls do not know the relationship between the menstrual cycle and pregnancy. So yeah, and contraceptive use as well.
So in fact, the SRIH literacy will have to take into consideration basic knowledge.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Functional literacy.
Yes.
So for example, if a girl cannot read a sentence, and this is not only young girls, by the way, you know, girls who like left school in 2nd grade, or who never went to formal school and who couldn't read a sentence.
Yes.
Okay. So then in this case, how do you I mean, this concept of sexually transmitted infection, this concept of menstrual cycle and its relationship with pregnancy, then how do you relay this information?
I know in my community in Algeria, you just don't use materials where there is writing. You explain it verbally.
Yes.
You use some image, but they understand perfectly.
Okay, that's great. Yes, we spoke with someone in the education department at EUB, and he recommended similarly to basically use not only pictures but three-dimensional. What is it called? Like three-dimensional, in order for three-dimensional prototypes.
Yes, prototypes, because
yeah.
I have family who are illiterate, but for example, if they are following a show on TV that explain health, sexual health, or any health, they understand it. But you need to use very simple words and a lot of, like you said, objects and stuff like that, like you are explaining to a child.
Right. Yes. Oops. I actually need to go back to my other. Let me see.